All right, welcome. It's been a while since I've done a live show on my channel to Underground Catholicism. I have the pleasure of having Father Joseph Sweden on. Um, we are going to be discussing original sin and related to that topic, Immaculate Conception, which are my two favorite topics to talk about. Um, and Father Joseph, how are you today?
I'm okay, thank God. Things are going well.
Good, good. What have you been up to lately besides the stuff you were talking about earlier?
Oh yeah, well, no, I've just been putting together some videos, doing some other things that kind of have to be done. I've got an article that I'm working on
Awesome.
that's taking a little longer than I'd like, but hey, things happen.
Yeah, better late than never, right?
Mhm.
Sweet. Okay, well, today we're it's not going to be one of those formal debates where I put you on the seat and ask you questions and then you do the same thing to me.
Mhm.
It's just a free flowing dialogue. So,
Okay.
just I like these better because they're not restricted. I'm not, I've done one debate before. I enjoy doing it. I didn't think I was going to enjoy it, but I did enjoy it. Um, but I prefer these more because I like the free flow. I don't want to be restricted with times and rules and stuff like that. So and I like to give uh, my guest all the time that they want as well. So we're going to start off with a lot of times we talk about Immaculate Conception, we just jump right into the Immaculate Conception. Um, I, I don't think that's very productive. I think we have to first understand original sin and see where we're coming from and where your side is coming from to see if there's any similarities or differences, right? So, if you could start, Father, by explaining to us from the Orthodox perspective, what is original sin or ancestral sin?
I would say this original ancestral sin. Really, there are two ways of saying the same thing. There's not a real difference in terms of the concepts. A lot of times, original sin, and there's a bigger problem, I would say, in modern Orthodox thought, in that certain very large scale thinkers that became very popular, especially in the 1970s and 80s,
Yeah.
were nearly Pelagian in their thinking. And so they kind of discounted everything related to original sin. Original sin wasn't real. Ancestral sin wasn't. Granted, there are differences between the Orthodox and the Roman Catholic conception of original sin. Um, I would say the easiest way to describe it is one of severity. But that doesn't mean the language doesn't exist in Orthodoxy at all.
Right.
That's insane. You just look at the Council of Jerusalem, and one thing I do want to clarify
Sure.
is that the proper Orthodox position on original sin is not terribly different, original ancestral sin, what you want to call it,
Yeah.
than what Roman Catholics understand to be original sin. There are differences, but not as great as people think.
I agree, and I'm glad you're in that camp because there are two camps in the Orthodox Church, as you've seen in the well, you're not on Twitter anymore, but when you were on Twitter, you did see that
Yeah.
war when that bishop came out with that.
Well, what he said was nearly Pelagian, and the fact that he's had to correct himself twice now on video, or once or twice, he's had to have a lot of clergy basically kind of have to do speaking on his behalf to clarify that that wasn't what he meant. Tells you, even if that was not what he meant, he clearly said something wrong, or there
Yes.
wouldn't be an uproar.
Yeah, it's poorly worded. Regardless, if it's not what he meant, that's not how you should
Uh,
word it, right? You can't
as a
say we're as
bishop, you have
pure.
a responsibility to choose your words carefully. So
Absolutely, yeah. To say that we're as pure as Adam was before the fall, I mean
that's insane.
yeah, exactly. So I'm glad we're on the same page there. Now there are some Eastern Orthodox out there that will, like as you're saying, they're Pelagian, so they would reduce original sin to merely being the effects of original sin just being physical death. Have you seen that in the
I have, and but I when people are that, you have to realize that Orthodoxy does not have that kind of what do you call it? Kind of defined attachment to hierarchy. If
yeah,
somebody is a Pelagian, we're not really afraid to call them out as Pelagians, and that's why you see this play out as it is. Many people who frankly are Pelagians calling themselves Orthodox getting called out by Orthodox. But the point is, our view would be if somebody is openly teaching Pelagianism, I mean, from my perspective at least, they're not Orthodox.
Yeah. Let me know if you agree with this. So from the Catholic perspective, and you mentioned earlier that we have similarities and mostly similar teachings on original sin. So as a Catholic, what we would say, this is not all of original sin, right? But we emphasize as Catholics the spiritual defects of original sin, where I think the Orthodox brothers, such as yourself, might emphasize the physical defects of original sin, such as death, toil, physical labor, suffering. The Catholic is, and again, we're not denying the other side. Both of us are not denying the other side, but the Catholics will emphasize the fact that when we come into the world, or when we're conceived as children of wrath, where we're in need of a savior, where we're void of grace, or what we call sanctifying grace. Is that pretty much in the what you believe as well as Orthodox, those twofold teachings of original sin?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the things that you chose to label as Orthodox attributes of privation tend to fall under the umbrella of alienation from God.
Yeah.
And
yes.
So that's really that's really where the emphasis is. That said, I would probably agree with what you're saying here. It doesn't sound to me heretical. I mean, in terms of wrath, there are even bishops in the 15th and 16th century who use that language.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so we've established that, because it's very important for us to understand what we're talking about, because we could be talking past each other, right? When we're talking about the Immaculate Conception. So now the question is, setting Mother Mary aside, let's just talk about everyone else that's ever existed besides Christ. Obviously, we know that he had no original sin by his divine nature. But setting aside Christ and Mother Mary, when we are conceived, you nailed it on the head. I think you said it perfectly. You said alienated from God. So you would agree that everyone is conceived alienated from God. And what Polemos and Saint Simeon of the theologian, he would say, like, there's two types of deaths. There's a physical death and there's a death of the soul. The death of the soul is the alienation from God. So that's how we're all conceived and we're all born, right? You would agree with that, you would say?
It doesn't sound wrong. Now the question of whether, you mentioned Christ and the Theotokos, and you didn't. Okay, I'll leave that alone for now.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just curious because I'm always curious as to how these concepts like the Immaculate Conception came to be.
Sure.
And so it was interesting that you mentioned Christ and then the Theotokos, and in terms of their conception being something separate. Now, this was originally kind of where the earliest debates on the Immaculate Conception occurred in the 11th and 12th century, among the scholastics. And so there were many who argued, based on the feasts of the Conception, Christ, the Theotokos, and St. John the Baptist, that St. John the Baptist was also without original sin.
Yes. And
so this is something that, granted, obviously I don't believe that St. John the Baptist was without original sin, but the point is that it is interesting to look at the history of the theory behind the Immaculate Conception.
Yes. So, St. John the Baptist, I think both of our traditions would agree that he was cleansed while he was in the womb, but he was conceived with original sin.
Yeah.
So at some point,
I think that we would say the same about the Theotokos as well. Although some people do say it's at the Annunciation, but
yeah, and I want to hear your thoughts, because that was going to be one of my questions. What are your thoughts as far as when she was cleansed from what you would call original sin?
I would say that it was probably in the womb, but I consider the concept of cleansing to be a process. Yes. So I would say that that was completed with her acceptance of the Lord's will. So it began, she had to be in other words, she didn't have original sin because she had to be a proper vessel. Yeah. But that process didn't complete until she was officially going to be that vessel.
Okay. So let's go back to her at the moment of her conception, or if you want to say from the moment of her conception, because when we say at, it sounds like it was completed at that moment. But when we say from, it begins there. So let's use the word from the moment of her conception. would you say that she was conceived also alienated from God?
Yeah, she was conceived through sexual activity.
Okay, so when she was conceived, all those titles that we described earlier, so she was a child of wrath, she was conceived void of grace, and then she was void of God in her soul. She was
Yeah.
just okay. So is that a common Eastern Orthodox teaching, or is that are there opinions on?
I'd say that the use of the child of wrath language is not common among Eastern Orthodox to begin with. It's where you get into kind of it's if that's the standard teaching for humanity,
Yeah,
then yes, it's still applied to it.
it would apply to her. Now, what about the terms? I know this is more of a Western term, but it is scriptural from Genesis 3:15 when Saint Augustine would say something like under the dominion of the devil, where someone is born under the dominion of the devil, and all that means
Or the
is
dominion of sin, yeah.
exactly dominion of sin, dominion of death, and all the
Yeah,
things
no.
that the devil.
Well, St. Augustine wasn't wrong on a lot of these things. I think that, unfortunately, I'd have to say that Pelagian current that
Yeah,
kind of gained vogue in world Orthodoxy in the 1970s and 80s was also very anti-Augustinian, and I think that
yeah.
a lot of what they say about St. Augustine, frankly, they don't give him enough credit for. So no, I don't think he's wrong on that. I think that that's language other fathers use as well.
I'm glad you said that, Father, because that I agree with you at 100%. Because when I read Augustine and his idea of original sin, it goes well with. I mean, it's almost like Palamas is teaching the same thing when I read
Yeah,
Palamas.
they're not the and Saint Gregory Palamas knew of Augustine and quoted him occasionally.
Yes, exactly. So that's, and then you have the Synod of Jerusalem who pretty much agrees with that
In
too. So
1672.
yep. And you go back to Carthage and Orange and all those that were accepted in Trullo. They say that original sin is we're born into sin, right? They call it
Yeah.
sin,
Now,
right?
keep in mind, Orange is not accepted in Trullo, to my knowledge, but it is still considered a valid and
Sure,
Orthodox council. It's
that's
just it was
okay.
a Western council that wasn't,
Yeah, and it was the mind of the Western fathers, right? Where
yeah,
the school of, again, Augustine, but we're saying it's the school of both East and West. I did a show. My first show I've ever done on my channel was Immaculate Conception, Original Sin, and stuff like that. And I only quoted Eastern fathers. I didn't even go into any Western fathers. And then I also quoted, Palamas and Saint. I love Saint Simeon, the New Theologian,
okay.
because I think that he sums up all the fathers perfectly. Like what he teaches on original sin is expanded at that time, and it's explained in details as to what it is. So that's why I like to use him. Now, going back to Mother Mary. So at her conception, would you say that there's anything unique about her conception? Because I know there's some teaching in the Eastern Orthodox about about her parents having dispassion when they came together.
Yeah, I mean, well, they were old, so to
Yeah,
some degree, I mean, if you're looking for the fire of passion there,
yeah,
it is natural to say it's dispassionate. It was two old people.
yeah.
It's just not the same.
Right.
And so, and they, that under normal circumstances, such a conception is almost impossible. Say
Yeah.
almost because anything's possible with God,
Sure.
and even today we do see occasionally a random senior couple will conceive a child. It
Sure.
has happened. It's
Right.
not, but it was never meant to be like it wasn't like the conception of Christ without another human.
Right.
It was still a human conception.
But in addition to them being old, would you say that the tradition is that it was dispassionate because of their holiness, because they were righteous?
I would think I mean they were chosen for the task.
Yes. Right.
So that's a given.
Yeah.
Um excuse
Um,
me.
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
No,
So,
I burped.
oh no, it's okay. Okay. So, back to Mother Mary. So, there are some that I've seen in the. So I had. Are you familiar with Father John Ramsey?
Mildly. We've spoken occasionally over the Facebook and
Okay.
yeah. I don't really know him. He's a nice guy from what I can see.
He's a very nice guy. Yeah. So I had him on discussing this very topic, and it sounded like to me, and he's not the only one. I've seen Eastern Orthodox teach the same thing. So they say that there is something unique about Mary's conception. Oh,
Yeah.
go ahead. her parents' conception, right? Not Mary's conception as Christ, but her being conceived. There's something.
Yeah, well, I'd say that. I mean, from my perspective, the entire conception, birth, childhood, etc. of the Theotokos is unique.
Yeah.
There are fathers who do hold to a position very similar to saying that she was conceived in a special way, conceived in all purity. I've seen that, and that you do see that occasionally, especially in Russian fathers of the 17th and 18th century.
Yeah.
So, I mean, for me to say that I know better than them would be a little it would be dishonest on my part.
Okay, so and I just want to read something real quick from the Catholic Encyclopedia as to what we mean by Immaculate Conception, because a lot of times from the Eastern Orthodox perspective, they're thinking we're saying that she's that she had all the privileges that Adam and Eve had before the fall. So, but that's not what we're saying. And here, let me read it.
Well, there are Catholics who do say that,
and those are in the smaller circle. I don't think those are the majority.
Well, that's part of the reason why I'm saying. But I mean, I hate to say this, and this is true, among Orthodox, but it's true especially among more unified bodies like the Catholics, that the Overton window gets moved by the people on the most extreme fronts.
Yes.
And so the point is that, yes, that there was a minority party that was basically saying she had all the privileges of Adam and Eve, but then this led to problems with the 1950 dogma of the Assumption being promulgated, because the universal tradition was that Our Lady of the Theotokos died. Yeah. But there's that faction again saying, oh no, it doesn't actually say that in the dogma, so I guess she didn't. So they believe that functionally she didn't die. She literally, they look at it like she took a nap, and that's in complete opposition to the entire tradition of the church.
Yeah.
So it has effects.
I believe she died, and I think the majority of the theologians would say she died, even before and after 1950. There are those small minority that you mentioned. Now, but I don't think anybody goes as far as saying she had all the privileges of Adam and Eve, because no one says that she never suffered, right? No one says that she never got sick. Like, those are privileges still that Adam and Eve enjoyed before the fall. And she had those things, right? So what we would say, before I read this, I just want to explain the Immaculate Conception for us. And I think you can find something fascinating about this idea. I know this is kind of like a Western mind where we're just thinking too much, right? But in the Western world, we would say that the Immaculate Conception is God giving the necessary grace or necessary privileges for her to carry out her divine maternity role. So, for example, her having no concupiscence, no internal struggles, like no temptations on the inside, where she can have physical temptations like Christ had with the devil externally tempting him. She could have that, but the internal temptations we say that she didn't have. So that's because we believe that that's necessary for her to carry out her role as divine maternity. So God made sure that she had no concupiscence. The fact that she always had God in her soul from beginning to end. So the fact that she was graced from the very beginning all the way to the end of her life. So those are all privileges given to her for the purpose of her to carry out her role as divine maternity. The privileges are not connected directly to her being conceived immaculate. The privileges are connected to her role as Mother of God. It's indirectly connected to her being conceived immaculately. And of course, that has to be there for the privileges to be there, but they're there for the purpose of her to carry out that role. It's not there just for her to have something special for her only, right? So it's Christological in a sense. And I think the fathers talk that way, and I think even in your church you would agree with that, because you would say that she was given special grace. She was given privileges that we didn't enjoy. For example, like a virgin birth. She bore God virginally. So she was given those things for her to be able to carry out that role, for her to say that yes when it came to the point at the Annunciation. Here's the question, and she would say, as God made sure that she had enough to say yes. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I'm not a big fan of the whole, saying that Westerners are overthinking it thing. Up until I was ordained a priest last year, I used the Western Rite for the better part of a decade and a half. But what I would say is that, and this is kind of it, we're always going to be in that kind of, I guess you could say, slippery position between Pelagianism and full predestination. There has to be some place, I think, where we have to, like, for example, if we're supplying all of these graces and we're saying she had to have every level of grace necessary to be able to become obedient to God, effectively, we do reduce her to an automaton.
It takes away from her.
Because you're taking away from her actually freely saying yes.
That's a great point. Yeah.
And so that's definitely something that's probably where I would be, most disagreeable. In the sense that, her free choice is what completed, the beginning of the offering. So that's what I would throw in.
Yeah, I would agree with you. Free choice is always going to be there for her. She always has to have that free will. And for me, the way I think of free choice isn't the choice between good or bad, right? Having the freedom to choose means you choose the good. Like, she was freely choosing the good. It wasn't like she had a temptation to choose the bad ever. I think you would agree with that, right? Like, you don't think that she struggled with sin like we would, right? She always.
I don't think that she struggled with sin per se, but the fact remains that if she is presented with an option, to say that the option is irresistible effectively destroys the choice. Like, if you say, how could she even have possibly conceived of the bad? This by default implies she could not conceive of the bad, which means it wasn't a choice at all.
Right. So let's think of it this way. So in the East, there is the teaching, and I think it's in the West as well. We just don't use the word, but theosis, right? Explain that to us. What is theosis, and how is that different?
And we're getting all the buzzwords today.
Oh yeah.
In any case, I'm so sorry. I don't know. I'm sensing some pain here, but anyway, theosis is a very straightforward concept.
Yes.
Believe it or not, it is to some degree found in the Western Fathers.
Yes, of course.
But the concept of theosis is very simply, eventually, as you continue to participate in the life of God in the church, that slowly you become more and more united to God.
Yes.
Which eventually, as it's often quoted, God became man so that man might become God.
Yeah.
But that's referring ultimately to union with God and that manifestation of how that union occurs while people are living after their death, etc.
Yes. So for someone to have what you described, so theosis, they're advanced, they're very holy, right? Mm-hmm. I think that person is always going to choose the good freely. Right. There's never, of course, the option to fall is always there as humans. Right. But when you have that, when you taste the Lord and you see the beauty and you feel that joy and you're at peace, you're always going to choose the Lord freely. Right. And that's what I'm getting at.
I'm a little concerned with the concept because, for a lot of the concepts behind theosis, etc., are often found in things like the Desert Fathers. Yeah. But the problem is that in those same Desert Fathers, we see examples of people falling. We see examples of people being misled by demons.
Of course.
The point is, so somebody who understands theosis would still want to work out their salvation with fear and trembling because they'd have that knowledge that they could lose it. Even if they were at a greater spiritual state. So in other words, it's still voluntary, but it's only because of an increased awareness of the consequences of not choosing correctly.
Okay.
So it's not like they don't lose their sense of free will. It's just that they have more of God's understanding so that they don't make the wrong decisions. Right.
Now, what about in heaven? Like, do we continue to grow in holiness in heaven, right? It's not something like just because you're in heaven now, that's where you stop growing in holiness, right? Would you say that?
There's multiple mansions as mentioned in the gospel. So I would say that I don't know that it's constantly eternal progression. Yeah. I think, time you will, do more, in the service of God over time. But I'm not dead, so I don't know how that translates.
Right. But what I'm getting with that is when we're in heaven, we still have freedom, right? But that's what I'm saying. Freedom
Oh,
isn't.
yeah, no, I think that once you die, once your death occurs, that's kind of it's kind of your fundamental stance has kind of been determined.
I
Like
I
so,
I
so you
agree.
can't you can't get out of heaven or hell.
No, you
It's
can't. No, you can't.
right.
But that's my point, right? My point is you still have the freedom not to choose bad, but you still have free will. Free will
Yeah,
doesn't
on
mean
Earth.
well, like free will. Maybe we're talking past each other, but when I say free will, maybe you're thinking I'm saying free will between good and bad. But free
Yes.
will is the freedom to choose what you're supposed to do,
Okay.
right? So I'm supposed to do God's will.
Right.
God gives me the freedom to do that.
Yes.
I'm not supposed to do the bad,
No.
right? So so that's where I was getting at with Mother Mary. She has the freedom to do God's will, and she always does God's will. So everything that she does is for the greater glory of God.
Right, but what I'm saying is that there's alternate explanations as to why she does that. In
Of
other
course.
words, it does not necessarily have to mean, for example, that she has been so filled with grace that she logically cannot do evil. I think what is probably more likely, considering the nature of the conception, etc., is that she is very much in tune with God's plan and therefore does not do evil because she knows what's going to happen, even though she's clearly surprised by the crucifixion. But the point is that she has some awareness of what is supposed to happen in the plan of salvation.
Okay, so
But
I would agree with
that,
that.
yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So that
But I
that
don't think that it's necessarily mystical. I mean, that could have been Christ telling her in his childhood.
yeah,
We just don't know.
right, right. I think the way you just articulated that's perfect. So I would that's why I'm saying I think we're saying the same thing, but we're talking. I'm not saying because she was given grace that it was impossible for her to fall, right?
Right.
I'm not.
Right.
I'm
We
saying
never
that
want to go there because then that's full predestinationism.
exactly. You're right. So that's not what
There
I'm
is no
talking.
free will. Right.
I'm saying she was so holy that she was given the grace and she was always going to choose God from the beginning to end. She's always going to choose God because she's so holy, right? So it's freedom of choice. She has the freedom of choice to choose God, and she does. When the angel came to her, she could have said no, right?
She could have.
She could have said no, right? But
I mean, what you would. I mean, think about it. If you're a very pious, but still, fairly young female, and you're told you're going to conceive the Messiah,
yeah,
who everyone had talked about, from childhood as being the savior of Israel,
right.
that's a pretty heavy burden to lay on someone. So the
Yeah,
choice was quite grave. It was not an
yeah,
easy choice by any means.
yeah. I can't imagine, right? I mean, absolutely. So that's one thing that we don't put in our minds. Like she's this 13, 14-year-old girl, and an angel
Yeah.
comes to her saying, you're about to conceive the son of God, yes or no? Like that's crazy, right? You don't hear that every day. So
Yeah, and she
um
was consecrated to the temple, so she's like a virgin that was planning on staying that way for, forever, and then
yes,
yeah.
exactly. Yeah. Now I do, before I forget, I do want to read that section, and it's a quick one or two sentences
Of the Catholic
about
Encyclopedia.
Catholic Encyclopedia about what we mean by Immaculate Conception. So because it'll tell you what we mean, it'll tell you what we don't mean. So
This is from the New Advent site.
yes, yeah. So newadvent.org.
Yeah, I have it up.
You have it up. Okay. You see where it says was preserved exempt from all stain of original sin. It's in big letters, and then it interprets what that means.
Yeah, okay, yeah. This is the breakdown of the dogma.
Yes, yes. So here's what it says. It says in interpretation of what's preserved exempt from all stain of original sin. What does that mean? And here's how it words it. It says the formal active essence of original sin was not removed from her soul as it is removed from others by baptism. So that makes sense. Like we have original sin, we get baptized, it gets removed. For her, it was excluded. It never was in her soul. Simultaneously with the exclusion of sin, the state of original sanctity, innocence, and justice, as opposed to original sin, was conferred upon her, by which gift every stain and fault all depraved emotions, passions, and abilities essentially pertaining to original sin were excluded. But, and this is where some folks in the East don't understand what we're saying, but she was not made exempt from the temporal penalties of Adam, from sorrow, bodily infirmities, and death. So, in other words, she was only given the spiritual privileges that Adam and Eve enjoyed, not the physical ones, because the physical ones would not help her in her holiness. It would not help her in making. In fact, it would actually help her more if she suffered, right? Because suffering can bring us closer to God. It would help her more if she died, because that's an imitation of her son, right? She's imitating her son in his death. Not, of course, not. We're not saying that she died for the world, but it's still an imitation of her son, and the fact that she physically died. So we have a twofold thing going on. We have the physical temporal penalties of Adam, and then we have the spiritual defects.
Okay.
She was made exempt from the spiritual defects. What are your thoughts on that? If you can touch on that from the Eastern Orthodox perspective.
Well, from what looking at this particular text, it's very interesting. It's the breakdown of the papal. I think what is the name of that dogma?
Ineffabilis Deus.
Ineffabilis Deus. Yeah, there we go. And basically, it has presuppositions that, of course, we have to question. So, in other words, like, I can agree with the description as you give it, but the phrasing is still was preserved exempt from all stain of original sin, and we have to follow that up with what it says after, by a singular privilege and grace granted by God in view of the merits of Jesus Christ, the Savior of the human race. This is not language where we're talking about preparation for the coming of the Savior. This is the reference to the merits of Jesus Christ. It's a can of worms that I'm sure you've probably not wanted to. You probably don't want to open up, because that's where we get into the whole question of the treasury of merits, the merits of the saints, indulgences, etc. So the point is, the language in that is still so loaded that for us it's uncomfortable to. I would freely admit that there were fathers who taught that Mary was conceived pure.
Yeah.
No problem. But it's all the layers.
Yes.
All the layers that unfortunately do exist and make it kind of create an impasse, because from your church's perspective, they're infallible. So they can't be wrong.
Sure.
But unfortunately, since we try not to get so definitive, and I've noticed it more lately, a lot. It's so strange. It's so strange. I grew up a Roman Catholic, and I was taught there were two infallible statements. One's on the Assumption and the Immaculate Conception.
Oh yeah, I've heard of that too.
But I've met way too many modern Roman Catholic apologists who say, "Oh no, there's way more infallible statements and way more infallible dogmas," and that's a little terrifying.
Yeah.
Because it tells me that even a basic concept has been lost when it comes to the concept of infallibility.
Yeah. No, I understand what you're saying, but if you can break it down, Father, because this is why we're having this conversation, and this is why I don't like debates, because I want to dialogue. I want to understand the other side, right? And I'm not an ecumenist. I'm just a realist. I want to know what really we believe, what you believe. So if you could, okay, so let me say this. What I just read, if you take out the Latinizations of it, right? So, and I'm going to just simplify it. Basically, what it's summarizing it as is that this woman was always in communion with God from beginning of her life all the way to the end. She always had grace from the beginning of her life to the end, and she had the Holy Spirit with her from the beginning to the end. That's what we're trying to say when we say Immaculate Conception. We're trying to say that she was never under the dominion of the devil, because we don't want her to have anything to do with sin. Is that acceptable to believe in the East?
I would say that it's an open opinion.
Okay.
Nobody doubts the holiness of the Theotokos.
Of course.
If you notice here, we use the title as assigned to her in the ecumenical councils.
Right.
I mean, she's in every iconostas. She's, everywhere. So the idea that, I don't want to give the impression that we're in some way, shape, or form Mariophobes or anything like that.
Right.
But the question has been open, and saints have been on both sides of the issue that either A, she could have been conceived immaculate, or B, she was given this privilege at the moment of the Annunciation.
Yes.
To be consistent, one must admit that both views exist. So it's not that I'm trying to put a stumbling block in the way, but if you've chosen one and said this is definitely the church's teaching, you miss out on half of what the church is teaching.
Okay, that's a good point, Father. So I do agree that there is something that happens to her at the Annunciation. Yep. And I think a lot of Catholics they're not aware of that. They're not aware of the fathers who say that she was sanctified or purified. That language could be very scandalous to them, right? If they read the fathers, because they don't understand that. They will say, like, why would she need to be sanctified or purified if she was already perfectly holy from conception? See, that's the wrong way of thinking about it.
Because, I know, but I get. But you see what I'm not introducing this to gotcha the Roman Catholics. I'm introducing to demonstrate there's a real. If you're trying to go by the fathers, and that's what I grew up with. I grew up being taught that we're supposed to go with scripture and tradition.
Yep.
And so for me, that has always had to be consistent.
Yeah.
But if the tradition has variance in it, it's better to admit that it has variance in it than to pretend one side didn't do that. That's why I was able to have some fun with the AI, because it's a computer, not a person, so it couldn't make those distinctions.
Right. So, correct me if I'm wrong, but let me know if you agree with this. So, and I think you would agree with this. I don't think the fathers that say that her conception was pure versus the fathers that say she was purified at the Annunciation, I don't think they're contradicting, because you have Saint John Damascene, where he says both. Right, he says that her conception was pure, and then he also says that she was purified at the Annunciation. I don't think those two things are
that implies it's a process.
It's a process, right? Exactly. So we agree with that, because when you're holy by grace and you're holy by what you're choosing to do, your free will, like we talked about earlier. When you're holy by grace, it's got to be a process. She's not holy by nature, right? So when the fathers say that Christ alone is good, Christ alone is holy, it's because he was holy by nature, right? He did not need grace to be holy. Like, it's his divine nature. He's a God. He's God, right? But with Mother Mary, her not divine nature. I mean that she became.
That's getting close to Nestorianism.
No, she became. Like the fathers say, like she became we become gods in a sense, right? Not God really, but like we become divine in a sense, right? But from the beginning, her nature was pure, but it was not divine. Like Christ's nature was divine, right? So she needed grace to be holy. And whenever you need grace to be holy, you cannot just be holy in one instant, right? It's a process, right? So I think you would agree with this, and let me know if you do. From the moment of her conception, would you say her conception was holy and was unique to her versus like how we are conceived? Not in the sense of the manner of the parents, but like something unique is given to her just to start her holiness, just to kind of spark it, right? And then it doesn't stop there. And then at the Annunciation, she receives what some fathers make it seem like at the Annunciation, she is receiving the grace and the holiness that we would receive almost like we're in heaven. Like it's almost like the eschaton, right? She's receiving that final purification. And of course, it's not literal, but they have a point. They're saying these things, and there's a point that she becomes more holy at the Annunciation, whereas before she was holy before the Annunciation, and then we get to the Annunciation, and now this woman is even more holy, right? Would you agree with that, or is there any issues that you would take with that?
I don't think I would take an issue with that per se. I just think that what we are missing there is that you have a beginning and an end, a completion to the process.
Yes.
And I'm not even against that kind of conception.
Yes.
The big problem that you have, though, is again the wording of the dogma, because the dogma does not say what we're saying. It just doesn't. Like if we take out all the explanatory notes and read it, it's literally the opposite of what we're saying right now.
Yes. No, I as far as the way the dogma is worded, I think, God willing, if the East and West ever united by God's miracle and God's grace, if we ever united, I don't think the East would use the terminology that the West is using. right? I think they would use, and here's what my opinion is, and let me know if I'm off here. I think with the West, they're more using language of things that um it's like a negative thing, right? It's like she did not have the dominion of the devil. Whereas the East would say that her conception had grace. Like it's a positive thing, right? It's her
I
conception
would
was
say,
pure.
well, right, but the phrasing of the dogma is actually that she was preserved, which means she wasn't even approached by it. So there's no possibility that that occurred. And that's why I was talking about that acceptive language earlier, because
Yeah.
it makes a huge difference in whether the Mother of God actually assented to the incarnation or she was an automaton. And I think we have to be careful
Yeah.
because words have consequences.
Yes. And even if you read, I was trying to pull it up. I don't know if I have it, but Ludwig Ott, I'm sure you're familiar with him. Actually, I think I have it right here. Um, this is what he says. This is from the Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma. He says, Mary grew in grace and holiness until death. While Christ's fullness of grace was perfect from the beginning, the Mother of God increased in grace and holiness up to her death. So what you're saying, we would agree with. And I think it's a misconception from the non-Catholic side, not just you,
Misconception.
right? Yeah, no pun intended. It's misconception to think that we would say that Mary was perfectly holy from her conception and she did not need to grow in holiness. Clearly, that's not what we teach, and even here, Ott is saying that. Um, and then he also says, if I can find it, he says, okay, he says, death is not a punishment for sin, but fitting that she dies. Let's talk about that if you don't mind, because
Okay.
there's like for me, when I die, it's because it's a punishment to me. It's a penalty of Adam that's on me, right? And same thing for all of us. But here's what Ott says about Mary. He says, for Mary, death in consequence of her freedom from original sin and from personal sin was not a consequence or punishment of sin. However, it seems fitting that Mary's body, which was by natural mortal, should be in conformity with that of her divine son, subject to the general law of death. So, in other words, like her death is not a punishment to her. And that's something that the Dormition fathers talk about all the time. What are your thoughts on this? Is that something that you guys
Well,
teach?
yeah, I mean, one thing that I try to avoid is language that implies that the Theotokos chose death. Because death is allowed upon us by God because of our sin nature, etc.
Yeah.
But when it comes to the Theotokos, I mean, I don't think that if she just kept saying, I want to live every day, that God
No.
would have allowed her to.
No.
But I think that the problem is that Ott comes dangerously close to this territory,
Yeah.
which brings us right back to the whole she didn't die camp.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? That
Yeah.
there's
Now,
problems.
now that language is explicit in the Dormition fathers, because they will say something like death had no what is the word, dominion over her. Like,
Well, when you say the Dormition fathers, do you have someone in mind?
so I have the book, but I wasn't really prepared to talk about that topic. I just saw the quote. But if it's this book right here, and it'll take me a long time to find something, but
What's the name of the book?
It's on the Dormition of Mary. It's by what's his name? Father Daly, Daley.
Okay.
So I think this is the part that I was looking at. Let me see.
On the Dormition of Delhi. Early patristic homilies. Let me see if there's a text on this available so we can review it.
So this is John Damascene, homily 2 on the Dormition. He says, this is page 206. He says, today the treasury of life, the abyss of grace, I do not know how I can say these things with my bold, fearless lips, is wrapped in a death that brings life. Undaunted, she draws near to death, having given...
Here, I can put it up on the screen.
Oh, perfect. Okay, good.
Give me just a moment. What page is that?
206.
Okay.
And it's paragraph number
206. All right, just
Yeah.
let me share my screen and I'll put it right up. See, what I like to do is I always go back to the fathers when possible. So if we have it handy,
and Father, I'm not here trying to prove that she wouldn't die. It's like it's just I'm saying the language is there from the fathers, and I think that's why Ott is using it.
Well, okay. All right.
So how
So
do I do this?
where were we?
Do I hit at the stage? I never done this
Yeah,
before.
at the stage.
Okay. Perfect. Okay. So the part that where it says today, the treasury of life.
Okay. All right. So here we go. Let's see here. Today, the treasury of life, the abyss of grace. I do not know how I can say these things without bold, fearless lips, is wrapped in a death that brings life. Undaunted, she draws near to death, having given birth to death's destroyer. If one may call her departure from the world, so full of holiness and life, a death at all. For how could she, so brimmed with true life overall, ever become subject to death's power? Still, she yields to the law established by her son, and as a daughter of the old Adam, she undergoes the ancestral trial, since giving her son, life itself did not refuse it. But as the mother of the living God, it's also right that she should be brought into his presence. For if God was concerned lest the first human being reach out his hand and take from the tree of life and eat and live forever, how can she, who has received the life that knows no beginning or ending, the life free from the boundaries of both birth and death, not live herself for endless ages? Then it says, long ago, God punished the ancestors of this mortal race who had gorged themselves on the strong drink of disobedience and had made their eyes of their heart drowsy with the wine of sin, weighing down their eyelids with sinful self-indulgence until they fell asleep in death. He banished them from the Garden of Eden and drove them away. But now Mary has shaken off all assaults of passion and has planted again the shoot of obedience to God our Father, introducing life anew for all her race. Shall not paradise receive her? Shall not heaven open its gates wide with joy? Surely it will. Eve once lent her ear to the message of the serpent and allowed herself to hear the enemy's advice, her senses all enchanted by the deceiving charms of counterfeit pleasure. She received the sentence of grief and sorrow, undergoing the pangs of childbirth, the judgment with Adam, of death and imprisonment in the depths of Hades. But Mary, the truly all-blessed one, lent her ear to the word of God and was filled with the energy of the Spirit. She bore the Father's good pleasure in her womb, at the angel's word, and without sensual passion or contact, conceived the very person of God the Word, who fills all things. She brought him into the world without suffering the pains that adhere to our nature, for she was wholly united with God. How shall death consume her? How shall the realm of death receive her? How shall corruption dare to assault that body once filled with life? These things do not belong to her. They are all foreign to the body and soul of the one who bore God. Death saw her and was afraid, for he had assaulted her son, but had learned from his defeat and grown wise from the experience. For her, the gloomy path down to the underworld remains untrodden. A straight, gentle, easy path to heaven is open for her. For if Christ, whose life and truth has said, "Where I am, there will be my servant also," is it not even more certain that his mother will abide with him? She bore him before she knew suffering. Her passing from life too must be free from suffering. The death of sinners is burdensome, but since in her the sting of death, which is sin, was quelled, shall we say that the end of life was anything but the beginning of a better life, one that will know no end? Precious, truly, is the death of the saints of the Lord God of hosts, and precious above all the rest is the passing of the Mother of God.
Yeah. So
it's a very nice text.
It's very beautiful, right? And so
yeah.
this
yeah, absolutely.
It's poetic, right? So it's not like, hey, literally she could have chosen not, like you're saying, like it's not like she could have chosen to say, I want to live forever. It's not like that, right?
Well, it was impossible, right? But that's exactly the point of the Dormition, is because she, in her virtues as the Theotokos, she lived a holy enough life that normal human death no longer befit her, which is why God took her body up when she fell asleep.
Yes.
So I mean the things tie together just fine.
Yeah.
But again, there's there's Father Boniface. Hey there. So that's something that I would say I would agree with. I mean, I think St. John is stating the Orthodox teaching very clearly here.
And I think it's just St. John's point is, since she bore life in her womb, how could she be dominated by death? That's his point. I don't think he's saying, because she was immaculately conceived, therefore this is applying to her. I think it's more of a connection with having Christ in her womb, like so united to God physically. Like she was physically united to God. No one has ever had that. No creature's ever had that type of unity with God. It's unique to her. And so because of that, death has no reign over her, right?
Well, she also has the next 30 years with God too. So
exactly. So I mean, this is great, and I'm glad we're talking, because there are some folks out there, and again, you're saying it's open, right? So as an Eastern Orthodox, you can hold to the fact that Mary had a pure conception, right? That's not heresy.
You
Like you're
can,
saying,
yeah.
some
It's
saints,
not heresy by itself, no.
right? Okay.
To say that her conception was sinless is allowed. To say what's said in the dogma is not.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. And all the like the treasury of merits and all this. That's what you're saying.
Everything attached to that dogma makes the whole thing bizarre and leads to things like the automaton and whether Mary can die, so on and so forth.
Yeah. And again, like you're saying, you're not saying that's Catholic teaching as far as those things, but there are some people in the Catholic Church that hold to those. Now, again, those are minority. I've only seen one person in my whole life that actually thinks that Mary had all the privileges of Adam and Eve, meaning like she could never suffer or get sick. And that was weird. And he's actually an apologist. I won't even name him, but he's an apologist. And he thinks that she had no way, she was not able to suffer, and she didn't die. Like that's just weird to me, right? That's just so unpatristic.
But is it not tan books? I mean, there's definitely publishing houses and stuff putting out that stuff and getting the imprimaturs to print them. And so, once you got the imprimatur at the front of the book, people see it as a carte blanche.
I mean, I don't know if it was Tan. I mean, the guy that I'm talking about, he's just an online apologist. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to blame Tan. They make a lovely douay-rheims, but the point is they publish a lot of interesting stuff, to say the least.
Makes sense. Okay. Any direction you want to take? Because I think I've exhausted the directions that I've taken it, but anywhere you want to take it.
Yeah. One thing that I always find interesting is that there was debate over the concept of the Immaculate Conception.
Yeah.
But it seemed like the question of they could have gone with, say, the Dormition, which has almost no disagreement, as the first dogma they chose.
Yeah.
But in the midst of what was happening in Rome at the time, along with the chaos between the political sphere, the Ultramontane, so on and so forth, I feel like they kind of picked the Immaculate Conception dogma on purpose. Like, my personal view is they picked it to be more divisive, to kind of get rid of any dissenters to the concept eventually of papal infallibility. So in some ways, it's not that I feel like papal apologists can abandon the dogma. They can't. But I think if when you put everything in context, it's a very uncomfortable place to be, because there is so much lauding and glorification of the Theotokos in the Orthodox tradition.
Right.
Like, you can see that all day. You just look at the Akathist hymn. But the point is, eventually, I guess my question to you would be do you feel that the dogma's nature as a dogma limits you from really experiencing the fullness of the patristic tradition concerning the Theotokos?
As far as the Immaculate Conception?
Well, as far as the conception, the life of the, etc. What I'm asking, therefore, is, do you feel like it holds you back from really grasping the whole thing?
I think it's good that we're having this conversation, because when we're talking and I'm throwing out these concepts, and I'm trying to wrap them in more of like the Eastern tradition, right? And then you're saying, I don't have a problem with that, and I can agree with that, and I don't see any issues or heresies with that. I think the dogma, if it's misunderstood, and it is misunderstood by Catholics, I'm not even talking about Eastern Orthodox or Protestants or Muslims or whatever, but by Catholics, it is misunderstood, then you have an issue with what you're saying applies 100%, right? But when the dogma is understood properly, where you can say, okay, she does grow in holiness, she does grow in grace, she does have the freedom, right? She does die, she does suffer, she's not exempt from all the privileges and things of Adam and Eve. When you understand it properly, I think it's very close to what the East believes, in my opinion. And when you strip away all the Latinizations of what you're saying, because that's a whole different topic for another day. But I want to stick to what we mean by Immaculate Conception. Again, is she always had unity with God. She always had grace. Her conception was pure, as opposed to ours. Hers is unique, right? And a lot of Eastern folks would say amen to that, right? I don't think it holds me back. And I think it's very patristic to understand Mother Mary that way, because even when they talk about her at the Annunciation, they're not saying, "Hey, this is the point where she becomes holy. This is the point where she becomes pure, right? They're saying this is the point where
Well,
she
some
becomes
language
more
did
holy.
kind of some language does kind of indicate that that's the point. But the point is that it's not universal among the fathers on that. But the bigger question that I have,
Yeah,
again, is if the answer can be found to some degree in the consensus patrum, what's the need for a dogma to begin with? This is, I think, where and it gets uncomfortable because it always comes back down to the concept of the papacy.
papacy. Okay, so let me touch on that if you don't mind. So
yeah, sure.
The way the dogma came about, it wasn't the Pope who just decided to declare this dogma. It didn't come from the Pope.
No, there were a number of parties involved. It was chaotic. You mentioned Gasser's Relatio, so you do know about that. So you know about the intrigues of Vatican I, the old Catholicism. I don't have to give you a lecture on that.
Yeah.
But the point is that for me, 1870 is simply the codification of 1075, which is exactly the same concepts are there in their nascent form 10 centuries before, which is why as I've pointed out, I usually say that Hildebrand of Savannah or Pope Gregory VII invented the Roman Catholic Church, because the structure of bishops working together or dividing, etc., so on and so forth, versus the monarchical model. Ultimately, if you have the monarchical model, even if the Pope declared himself not to be infallible tomorrow, it wouldn't matter because he's still at the top of the pyramid. But the pyramid is where I see the problem, and that's why I like looking at all the fathers. And when you do that, you start realizing that kind of the concept of dogma is so different because we believe in things that are handed down and fighting over them. Like, for example, this is a problem that I've encountered. I don't know if you feel this way, but I know that when I talked, for example, to Michael Lofton a couple of years ago, and I mentioned everything could be settled by tradition, and he was like, no, it can't. And they used birth control as an example. And I said, no, birth control is universally condemned by the fathers. You can't use it as an example. And then he brought up something about St. Justin Martyr and claimed he was what did he claim he was? Some kind of early heretic. But I was like, that's ridiculous. And no, that's not acceptable.
Yeah.
But the point is that when you look at the faith and the dogmas of the church as handed down through consensus, the concept doesn't make sense of the dogma of the Immaculate Conception. And that's where I think we're really running into all these problems, is just because of that.
So let me touch on that, because so where I was going with this is, as far as the way the dogma came about, let's forget the debates in the 12th century, 11th century, all that stuff. Let's just go straight.
Right, 18th century, 19th century, yeah.
Yeah, let's go straight there. Okay, so this is the way the dogma came about. It wasn't just like the Pope saying, hey, I want to pump my chest and I want to declare something so everyone sees that I can do it.
No, the ultramontanists pushed for a lot of that. No, it was not obviously just him.
No, and it wasn't him at all. Like, it had nothing to do with, like, he didn't even, like, it wasn't even in his mind. So the way it came about, and this is you can see this from history. I've done shows on this. I've shown sources on this. Is the lay people stood up and had a petition to the Pope. The lay people all over the world. It was I don't know how many signatures they got, hundreds of thousands of signatures or millions. I don't know how many. They countless amount saying, Pope, declare this as a dogma. Right, declare this, and he didn't do it at that point. He didn't say, okay, fine, I'll do it. Right, this is what he did. He polled all the bishops around the world, and he asked them. He said, "Do you guys believe this? And if so, should we declare this as a dogma?" Then the bishops went to their priest in their diocese, right, and they asked the priest, do you guys believe this in your diocese? Is this a belief? And the priest polled the congregation, their people, right? And they said, so not, like over 90% said yes from the lay people. It went to the priest said yes. The priest went to the bishops, over 90% of bishops said yes. And then it went to the Pope, and he got the data that everyone everywhere is believing in this. So if everyone believes in something, and at all, like if it's something that's believed universally, like it's believed in Rome, it's believed in Australia, it's believed in Iraq, or wherever, right? Then it must be something that is a teaching that comes from the fathers, and it comes from Christ, right? Because it's universal. Then he declared it. So it was a collegial act, right? Just because it's papal infallibility doesn't mean it's the Pope that just kind of like ignores what the church thinks or what the church says and says, I'm going to decide this. No, it's not. That's not how it happened. So I don't think it was more of like,
Well,
I don't think it was.
but that actually makes it a little more problematic, if I can explain a little bit.
Please do.
And what I mean by that is, if we go to that article in the Catholic Encyclopedia, one reason I am a big fan of the old Catholic Encyclopedia is because it was written by American Catholics who often were extremely critical of their church's teachings at the time, and would list, for frankly, uncomfortable facts. I mean, if we go down to the section where it says the controversy, mostly it's talking about the Feast of the Conception itself. But it does get into the debates between Dunscotus, the Franciscans, the Dominicans.
Oh, yeah.
That this was confused, very confused, up to the 15th century. And even when we talk about the adoption of the feast, we're talking about the adoption of the Feast of the Conception of the Virgin, not the Immaculate Conception, which isn't really settled until around the 16th century. But my point is, what I'm getting at here is that that's what I mean by kind of the faith kind of got decided as opposed to just accepting what was previously there. And a lot of this is the product of scholasticism. Rather than referring back to the fathers, they kind of started adopting reason as the primary driver of what is the doctrine of the faith. And that's we see the results. So yeah, it's very possible. Yeah. And I don't know. The history you're describing sounds a lot more like the history of the Assumption than of the Immaculate Conception.
The same. Both. Yeah, both. It was the same thing. So that's how the Immaculate Conception happened. But then they use the same thing with the Assumption. They're doing this today, right? There's people that are petitioning the new
for
Dogma
mediatrix of all graces. I know
it comes from the late.
But that goes back to that whole Overton window, how the zealot few can lead in a direction that may change things completely. But then that leads to other problems. And this sounds unrelated, but again, it comes back to that whole top-down sort of thing. Yeah. Who's the patron saint of the Eucharist? That's Pius the Ninth, is it, or Pius the 10th? Pius the 10th. I have to look it up. Is it Pius Definitely, it's Pius the 10th. It's the one who changed the order. And I don't know, are you familiar with that? Because that was a controversy that occurred a little after the Immaculate Conception thing, which led to a huge break. But he basically they referred to him as the patron saint of the Eucharist because he decided children should receive the Eucharist as early as possible. Yeah. Which is actually our position because we give communion to babies.
Which is the right way to do it, in my opinion. That's the way. But
he did it the wrong way. Yeah. Because there was a tradition that you'd have to be baptized and then chrismated or confirmed before communion. And so this led to such a shock that there were entire dioceses of the Roman Catholic Church in Asia that mass chrismated their kids just to avoid any confusion. Now, of course, most Roman Catholics think you get communion before confirmation. The whole thing's been kind of warped out of good wishes.
So I'm a Chaldean, so I'm lucky. But I'm a Chaldean Catholic.
Okay, so you got the chrismation early then. But I mean, I've heard horror stories of the Ruthenian, in many cases with Ruthenians, where if they went to Catholic school, they'd have to get confirmed at 13. They'd have to have their parents write, and the bishop would ignore it, and they just reconfirm them. Oh yeah. So the point is that there's a that's a problem in and of itself. And the worst part is the original Western tradition is the same thing, that you're supposed to chrismate first.
Yeah. So we're getting into different things.
Sorry,
No, it's okay, but because I'd love to bring you on, and then we can just talk the papacy. So we can talk about
that would be an interesting discussion because I got information for you.
Yeah. I mean, it's and this is why I don't necessarily like to debate the papacy with the Eastern Orthodox, and I'll tell you why. It's because my understanding of the papacy is not your traditional apologetics understanding of like the Catholic apologetics, where it's like they make the Pope out to be this one-man show, right? And they try to prove that. I don't think that's how the papacy works, and I don't think that's how the early church worked. I don't think that's how the second millennium church worked in the Catholic Church, right? Because we had councils in the second millennium, we had councils in the first millennium. There was never a time where in any millennium where the Pope stood up and just said, I'm going to put my foot down and this is the way it's going to be. And no one agrees with me. I don't care. My truth is my truth. And I'm going to declare it.
Have you ever heard Pius IX? Traditio soy yo.
But no, what I'm talking about is papal infallibility, decreeing something, right? So that's my interest, right? Because I have shows on this. I've looked into the history of papal infallibility, what it is, how it's supposed to work, versus how if it works differently than it's supposed to, then it's sinful for the Pope to act that way. So it's actually sinful for the Pope to separate himself from the Church, and to just to put himself in a room and declare something as dogma without listening to the Church.
I think you're going to be shocked if you study the investiture controversy a bit more carefully.
When we do a show, you can talk about that, and then we can discuss.
Oh yeah, if you want to do that, we'd be glad to. Just let me know when.
Yeah, we'll do a part 2 on this, because I think we're going away from the topic of Immaculate Conception, original sin. I mean, it's funny because I've done 2 parts. I mean, I've done 2 shows on my channel where there's multiple parts. It's Immaculate Conception, original sin, and then the papacy. So it would be kind of cool if you came on and we can talk about the papacy, as long as let me go back to what I was saying earlier. The reason why I don't like to debate the papacy is because we could be talking past each other. So you could be asking me for proof of the papacy, and I could be showing you something that the Pope is working together with the bishops in collegiality with the bishops to act right. And then you're saying, oh, that doesn't prove it, that Vatican I. I would say, yes, it does, because that's what the point of Vatican I was. And then you say, no, it's not. Now we got to debate, what does Vatican I teach? And that's really the debate that we should have first. Just like in this, the debate should be original sin. What is it? Now we agree with what it is. Now let's talk about Immaculate Conception. So with the papacy, what I'd like to discuss is, what does Vatican I teach about the papacy, in particular papal infallibility? We can talk about papal jurisdiction and all that stuff on another part, but again, as you know, that's a different animal. But if you don't mind, part 2 is, what does Vatican I teach about papal infallibility? Would you be okay with doing a show like that before we get into all the nitty-gritty stuff?
I feel like that, and maybe this is just me here, but I feel like it's a little too specific. And I will explain what I mean by that.
What do you suggest? What do you recommend? Go ahead.
Well, what I would suggest is this. If we were to do a show, does Vatican I confirm the Dictatus Papae? And I don't know how familiar you are with that document.
I don't think I'm familiar with it at all. Maybe you can explain it, and then ring the bell, something like that.
Okay. In 1075, Gregory VII was elected. And he created a document known as the Papal Decrees, or the Papal Theses, and that's what the Decretus Papae is. It's 27 statements, which, when put together, define the kind of what we think of as, like, if you read them with a couple of exceptions, they basically sound like the description of the modern papacy.
Okay.
However, they caused a civil war. They caused a synod to depose him. There was another pope elected who ended up being seen as like a local miracle working saint. Like, there was a massive schism in the West. And a lot of the things we tend to think of in Roman Catholicism today, and I don't mean as an Eastern Catholic, but as in the Latin Church today, are things that developed there. Like, the celibacy, the priestly celibacy requirement began under Gregory VII. The idea that the Pope was above all kings began with Gregory VII. The point is, that's why Hildebrand of Savannah, I usually say, when people ask, like, who invented the Roman Catholic Church? Now, I understand how, the different Eastern Catholic churches work. Before I became Orthodox, I had been going to a Ruthenian church for a couple of years. I almost switched rights. I don't want to get into how, in the end, I ended up becoming Orthodox, because it was a weird story, which nobody ever believes. And so, but the point is that I understand where they came from. They were mostly, they were formerly parts of national churches that basically agreed to, usually, like, if you look at the union documents of each group, they were willing to accept this. They just had to accept the supremacy of the Pope, and they forgot about him. From their perspective, the Latin Church often had no real meaning except to, avoid a war. And so that's kind of like where many of them came from. So I get that. So, because from an Eastern Catholic standpoint, the Pope is kind of a distant reality, as opposed to, like, constantly interfering in your dioceses. That's very rare. Like we see that now with the I forget which group it is in like India or something.
India, yeah,
that's very rare.
Yeah,
to see that is almost impossible.
Yeah,
because but that's my point. Is these are interesting times, and so what I'm looking for is when we talk about the prerogatives of Vatican II, that we do them in their own context, which means that majority Latin Church and their thinking processes and how they got there.
Yeah, and I think one of the most misunderstood sentence in all the councils that the Catholic Church has, including go back to the first millennium, because is the Vatican I, where it says the whole thing about the decree that the pontiff is irreformable in and of themselves and not from the consent of the church. I think that is the most misunderstood sentence, and that's what I do like 4 or 5 parts show on, just that sentence. Basically, I'm trying to unpack that, right? And that's what I'd love to discuss, because Eastern Orthodox will say, oh, see, that means that the Pope can do whatever he wants and no one can tell him anything, right? But that's not what it's trying to say. I understand why one would think that, because on the surface it's worded poorly, and that's how it's worded. But if you look at the discussions in the background as to what it means, it takes a whole different view. And you don't have to do this, but you're more than welcome to like watch the shows I've done before we do a show together, because I think it's good to see like your I don't want to say opponent, because I think we're having a very nice discussion.
I mean, one thing that I would point out is that what you're talking about in terms of those decrees of Vatican I, they did not mean as much as many, unfortunately, even many Latin apologists will say that they did.
Yeah.
But that is not because of the fact that they were trying to be balanced. That was because of the fact that they were on the defense. Remember that, this was, I forget when exactly the rest of the papal states were lost, but it's not far from this time where, the Pope declared himself prisoner of the Vatican, so on and so forth. Like, this was like the maximum concession that they could possibly give to get the modern state of Italy off their back, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's always a political side to things, but
there's so much of that in Vatican I.
Right, of course there is. I mean, they're trying to destroy the heresy of it's losing my mind. I mean,
modernism.
Not modernism. What's the other one? Where the local king has a say. Man, I've done shows on this.
Caesaropapism?
No, not that either. Man, I hope somebody types it in.
Well, I personally, I mean, if you're talking about Symphonia, I completely agree with that concept. But that's, I think that is the ancient concept.
No, not that. Man, what is though? It's a political term. It's a political movement. It's not so much a movement. It's a political movement that made its way into the church. It came from France. Man.
Gallicanism.
Gallicanism. Thank you, Father. Gallicanism.
We got a lot of great writers from Gallicanism.
I'm sure we do. And
Abigute, who became Father Vladimir and wrote Le Papacy Schismatique, which became known as the Papacy in English. It's actually part of a 3-volume set. But he was originally a Gallican priest who got censured so badly by his bishop for his history of France, because it was as balanced as possible, that he ended up saying this is ridiculous, and he became Orthodox. J.J. Overbeck, who became kind of the founder of the modern Western Rite. Like, these all tie back to that very period. So it's kind of interesting. Yeah, this is definitely something we should discuss, if not, even litigate to some degree.
Sure. So we have some questions here. I think it's a good time to put a period on this and see what questions we have on here. There was a Father Boniface Arms.
Yes.
Am I saying Arms? Okay.
Father Boniface. Hey.
So he says you cannot use it.
He's with us. He's our.
Okay, sweet.
Yeah, I know. I know him. He's a nice guy.
Oh, okay. So he says you cannot use the universal argument when the Roman Church claims universality when it is not. So you have a multitude of Roman Catholics who have been formed under their false universal umbrella. I think he's talking about when I was saying how a dogma was formed, the Immaculate Conception dogma was formed because everyone everywhere believed it. I think that's the point he's making. If I'm
right, probably because of stuff like the Gallicans, etc. That a lot of people didn't believe that. So but it became that itself became politicized.
Right. And then he also says, Because I think we were talking about the papacy from the Immaculate Conception, and I said, let's talk about that in a different show. He says, I
Yeah.
think it is hard to separate the Immaculate Conception from papal issues because they are intertwined in similar principles. Yes, it's hard, but it's still possible. I wasn't trying to focus on, the hierarchy and stuff. I was trying to focus on Mother Mary and what she, who she was and her holiness and stuff like that. That's the focus on the show. But we kind of went off tangent, which is okay because it's creating a part 2 of something that I'm sure folks would love to hear about. So that's going to be fun to talk about. Dioscor says, and I think this is a question to you. It's a 2-part, so I'll read it for you here. So if Father Joseph believes that his saints, like Palamas, etc., teach the abstract concept of the Immaculate Conception, then wouldn't that mean those who reject Palamas's words are falling into heresy, since the Lacarne Synod, which confirmed his writings and anathematized those who do not accept all of his teachings as in conformity with the divine sayings?
What I think what he's asking here is then basically is if people, if St. Gregory Palamas wrote something positively towards what would be considered the Immaculate Conception, wouldn't that mean that people should take it seriously and would be in heresy if they didn't? I would agree with that. I think that that is part of the reason we have the whole anti-Augustine thing in the Paris school. Yeah. It's people thinking that the saints and fathers are subject to revision, which they're not.
Yeah, like Saint, we talked about this on Twitter. Saint Dimitri, right? He explicitly,
Saint Dimitri of Rostov. I did read that. I did read that text.
Yeah.
I got the impression that he was speaking in a more broader sense of the entire pregnancy, as opposed to specifically the conception. But he does mention it. But again, that he had a lot. Now he had a lot of unique ideas. Remember, he's a compiler of the Great Lives of the Saints in Russian, so he had access to a lot of Latin saints that people had frankly never heard of.
Yes.
And so that gave him a worldview that was very different. I forget which is it Saint Barbara, I think, who spoke to him in his life.
Oh, okay, I didn't know that.
It was. I think it was. He's compiling the life of Saint Barbara, and he realizes she's using a specific set of Western prayers, and he's like, and she pops out, she appears and says, "Oh, look, you're praying like a Latin now," as a joke, because by using the structure, it was actually the structure of a liturgical office in the West.
So touch on that, because the Russian church, right? A lot of them did teach the concept of Immaculate Conception, and some of them were like defending, like you're saying, Latin terms, and things like that. And then like Saint Dimitri was supposedly one of them. So he supposedly has a homily on the Immaculate Conception itself. It hasn't been translated yet.
I haven't read it. But.
So I haven't either. But supposedly, like, he's explicit. Like, it's almost like you're listening to a Latin saint write about the Immaculate Conception. Now, of course, we don't know because we haven't read it. But the history does show that he did believe in the Immaculate Conception. And however, Eastern concept of it, or however you want to believe that. But
like, let me put it to you this way. Let's say I referred to it as the Holy Conception of the Theotokos.
Yeah.
I never used the term Immaculate Conception. That could still mean that I'm still in violation of the dogma as it stands because I refuse to use the word immaculate. But the point is, the meaning is still the same. That's what I'm trying to get at, is why, and that's part of why Father Boniface mentioned that the dogma and the papacy are intertwined. And that's a bit of a problem.
Yeah, but, and again, like I was saying, like, I don't think the West would force those terminologies on the East, like Immaculate Conception.
Yeah, right? But they force it on the West.
Well, because it's a Western, like these are Western terms, right? But like the East can understand something in their own way, and it's the same thing. Like a lot of times we talk past each other, right? Because you're using your traditional terms from like Eastern Orthodoxy, and I'm using like for example, sanctifying grace, right? You guys don't use that term, but that idea is still in the East, right? Sanctifying grace.
Well, there are Orthodox who have used the term sanctifying grace. The point I was trying to make with Saint Dimitri and with other Russian fathers, who you'll find, is that they were well educated in the Latin tradition of the pre-schism church.
Yes.
So they did use some of those terms. They did use terms like operatio, and they understood that to be mysterium. The point I'm trying to make is that one thing, I don't know if you've ever had a chance to, but I would definitely recommend this. Read it's a translation done by an Anglican, Russian Observations on the American Prayer Book.
Okay.
And it is a reference to the Anglican prayer book and what the Russian Synod thought of it. You'll see that these were not idiots. The people that were running the Russian Synod were not only versed with Latin, they were versed with the Latin fathers and even the liturgical tradition that the Anglicans were basing on when they made their judgments.
Right.
So I get very nervous, especially as someone in a synod with a Western rite, of saying that, okay, we have the Eastern terms and you have the Western terms, because I don't believe that.
Well, I mean, I think there is some reality to that, right? At least to some extent, right? Again, so I know there's Eastern Orthodox that would say sanctifying grace. They would use that, but there's some that I've talked to. They're like, oh, we don't use those terms. I don't even know what that means.
Yeah, most of those people I call renovationists. They don't like terms. They don't like terms that Orthodox would have used 100 years ago.
Right.
And they like saying mystical things, and they like being Pelagian, and they like saying that Jesus didn't come to save us from sin, but to teach us like Buddha. I mean, these people do not in any way. I don't think they honestly represent Orthodoxy. David Bentley Hart is an Origenist heretic.
Yes.
And people should refer to him as an Origenist heretic instead of saying, oh, that's the Orthodox guy. He is not the Orthodox guy.
Yeah.
He's abandoned Orthodoxy, and he's teaching people to do the same. Granted, it might get some apologetic points to be like, hey, that's your guy. But in reality, he's destroying souls. Right, and people who are doing stuff like that should be called out, not shown as representatives of Orthodoxy.
So if and I want to wrap this question in a bow and then throw it back and see what your thoughts are. So if Saint Dimitri is teaching Immaculate Conception and he's using Latin terms because he's influenced by Latin writers, like you're saying,
well, he can speak Latin, write Latin, so on and so yeah.
Yeah. So if he is, and he's teaching that as a teaching, like that's what he believes. How does that change things in terms of Eastern Orthodoxy? Because now you have a saint who teaches Immaculate Conception.
But I've already conceded that. For us, what that would be is I told you, a party of fathers who focus on the grace at the Annunciation. There's another party of fathers who focus on the grace before Mary was born, including the conception. That would just be another check in the box in that direction.
I see. Okay. And now you would agree that those are all reconcilable?
Yeah.
Okay, because I think they are reconcilable. Okay, so let's see what other questions we have. Let me see if I missed anything. He says, wow, thank you, Father Joe. This is from Dioscorus. Wow, thank you, Father Joseph, for the answer. It sounds like this means that for the EOs, if they don't believe in the concept of the Immaculate Conception, they're falling into heresy. That's telling.
Well, I would say that they have to believe the Theotokos is all pure, all holy, so on and so forth. But when you say the dogma with the concept of the Immaculate Conception, my mind goes to the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, which I do not recognize for reasons I've pretty much spent a half hour explaining.
Right. So would you say that she was holy from the beginning to end? Yeah. Is that okay to say? Okay. So she was pure from beginning to end.
Sure.
But we're not. Like from beginning, we're not holy.
Yeah, we're
okay. So I think we're closer than we think. And so let me just tell you, Father, the reason why I like to have these discussions. So I've discussed this with you now, Father John Ramsey, and then Subdeacon Daniel Kakish, who's a Oriental Orthodox Syriac, a good friend of mine. All three of you guys, I've discussed the same topic. Not to bring you on to debate you, right? I don't do that. When I do the Protestants, I debate them with this. But when I bring on Eastern Orthodox or Inter-Orthodox, what my goal is to show people that we're not as far as people think. We're not like the same, right? We're not teaching exactly the same things, but we're not as far as some people might like us to be on this. And that's my goal here, right? I'm not. That's what I'm trying to do here, and I think hopefully we've established that to some extent. Of course, I think we've established that it's not exactly the same, but there are some similarities, right? Would you agree with that?
Well, I mean, that of course we can agree with that. That's not necessarily. I don't think that's a big deal. I mean, I think we fundamentally kind of agree on what happens at the Eucharist, even if we disagree on how.
Yeah.
But that, to me, that it's not a high bar to clear. My view is this, because I believe that people should be united in truth.
Yes.
Not in approximations of truth.
Of course.
So, if the real, and I would say the papacy is probably the real stumbling block if we're going to talk about anything.
Yeah.
And the structure of the church, the ecclesiology that comes out of that. if that stumbling block, if we dance around that stumbling block, it's still there.
Yeah.
So we have to deal with that question head on. So I would be glad to come on for a second show just to deal with that question.
Yeah, that'd be fun. I mean, these are my two favorite. These are my three favorite topics: original sin, immaculate conception, and papal infallibility. And the other one I always like to discuss is the atonement, which is another thing that you've probably seen in Eastern Orthodox camps where they're trying to dumb it down or water it down to something to almost nothing.
Turn it into something heretical. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So another question for you. You're very popular, Father. So a lot of questions for you. What does Father Joseph think of the Marian apparitions where she referred to herself as the Immaculate Conception, like Our Lady of Lourdes and Our Lady of Good Success?
Oh boy, he tossed
He
it
opened
out
up,
there.
yeah.
He opened up the hornet's nest.
Yeah.
My general suspicion is I don't know what the origins of those are.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, when you're dealing with the supernatural and it's not of God, you kind of don't have many options as to what it is. So.
Yeah, but even if it is from God, like what you're saying, it sounds like you can accept that concept of Mary saying.
Well,
So
I feel like the problem is that I feel like sometimes these apparitions are the confirmation for a wrong idea. So, in other words, like if we don't find a bunch of fathers to do it, but there's logical derivation to say it and random apparitions, then suddenly that has become a perfectly acceptable substitute.
Right.
I don't know that I would hold that.
Yeah. So when I discuss Immaculate Conception with Eastern Orthodox, I don't even need to go to the fathers. I can go to enough Eastern Orthodox second millennium saints who teach.
I was more than happy for you to go with St. John of Damascus. I really appreciated that.
Yeah,
Dimitri of Rostov was very helpful as well.
Yeah. There's something that, and I'll send this to you because it'll take me some time to find. Someone sent this on Twitter, Kabbasalas, right? He has this idea of Mary not having, like, not being part of humanity to be judged, like as if like she was conceived and she was born and her whole life she was grouped under the same category of Christ, where of course Christ doesn't get judged whether he's going to go to heaven.
Right, but that's because
and the same concept he applies to Mother Mary. And I found that very interesting. I had the intention of showing that on the show and talking about it, but I forgot to pull it up. But are you familiar with that at all?
No, but it sounds about right. I mean, to me, I don't see anything wrong with it.
So you would say, I mean, to us in the West, it sounds like it's going a little too far, because to say that Mary doesn't get judged, right? To say that, like what his point is Mary is saved from the beginning. Like she doesn't, like the cross is almost like doesn't apply to her.
Her body was literally taken up into heaven.
Right. So when we say that Mary was preserved from original sin, so we're saying like the cross saved her, but like it saved her differently from us. Like you've heard the analogy, like we fall into a pit and we get picked up, right? And the Immaculate Conception is before she falls, she's prevented from falling. It sounds like that's what he's saying, and if that's what he's saying, that's okay. As a Catholic, of course, I believe that.
But you're wondering, how does that not jive with the definition? Like, how would an Orthodox not get that? That's pretty straightforward. The definition of the dogma, as we see it, if we can leave aside the merits question, all the other stuff, is a temporal event. It is an event that occurs inside time.
Yes.
What St. Milos Kabbasalis is talking about is the sum total of her life exempting her. It's not the same thing. Like one is a special power granted, and the other one is the sum total of the Theotokos' life. There's a big difference. Okay. So that's how I would see it.
Okay. Okay. And then we have another question. I think it's I don't know if it's a question. We already said that. Okay. So all the churches were unified in the beginning, East and West. It is what happened later down the road in history. Western Rite Orthodoxy is a bridge not only to Protestants, but also to Romans. So I don't know anything about Western Orthodoxy or anything like that, but you said you were part of that.
Well, I was using the Western Rite. I still will use it on request. I don't have a problem with that if somebody asks for it. But Father Boniface does use the Western Rite in Florida. But I can sum that up real quick for you. because most people, when they think of Western Rite Orthodoxy in the United States, it's like, I hate to call it this, but it's discount store Catholicism and Anglicanism.
Right.
Like basically, they kind of keep. We don't do that. Our synod, being True Orthodox and Old Calendar Synod, went through the trouble between the 70s and 90s to actually translate the complete Western services pre-schism. Like, it would shock people, and that's why so few people have seen them, to see how much is gone. Like when they talk about like how the new Mass changed the Mass of all ages.
Yeah.
Like the Tridentine Mass took out so much that was there that it was like their new Mass at that time because it was completely different. It's like a skeleton of what it was. There's so much richness to it that if people accessed it, they'd be able to see, okay, now I understand what a Western Orthodox concept is. Still using that language, we wouldn't even be having half of the arguments about language in Latin versus Greek because it wasn't relevant then.
Right.
It was a different world.
Yeah,
absolutely. So it's a different world when people walk into a Western Rite church that's legitimate.
Right. Now, I did find the quote. I'm surprised I found it so fast. Do you mind if I read it real quick? This is from Kabasala's.
Sure. Where is it?
Okay.
Can I see it?
Let me see. Let me pull it up on, because this is on my phone. So let me see if I can pull it up on little wall and barrier. Sorry if you guys can hear me typing. Okay, so it's on the, I want to say Annunciation, but hold on one second. Let me just see if I can do a word search and see if it's the same thing. Yes. Okay. So I'm going to copy and paste it on the private chat here.
Okay.
If I know how to do that.
You just have to.
There we go. So if you can open that up and then do this, because you know how to do the sharing.
Let me see this. Oh, okay. This is the full sermon. All right. Well, this is going to be interesting. Give me 1 second.
And the relevant part starts with the word, the middle wall and barrier of enmity. So if you do,
it's not that long. I mean, let me see here. Okay.
Let me know when. So do I do the add to stage now?
Yeah, you have to add to stage.
There we go. Okay. Hopefully, could make it bigger, maybe.
Yeah. Hold on. Let me. How's that look? Yeah. Okay.
That's perfect. Yeah, that's perfect.
Give me a second. Trying to find. There it is. All right. So what are we looking at here? It looks like it's a. Is this a sermon on the Annunciation, or what is it?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So let me see here. Okay. It shows.
So it's the part where it says the middle wall and barrier of enmity. That's the part that I'm talking about. But feel free to read whatever part that. I don't know if you're familiar with the homily or not, but that's.
I'm not. I'm reading it for the first time. It's very nice.
Okay. So if you don't mind, I want to read that part at least for the listeners, because it's kind of have like dead silence.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, no problem. Take your time.
So it says the middle wall and barrier of enmity were of no account to her. Indeed, everything that divided the human. I think you're going. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was reading.
No, it's okay. I'll pull it up from my end here. So everything that divided the human race from God was abolished as far as she was concerned. Even before the common reconciliation, she alone had made peace with God. Or rather, she was never in any need of reconciliation, since from the very beginning she stood foremost in the choir of the friends of God. However, such a reconciliation was made for the rest of mankind, and she was, before the Comforter, an advocate for us before God, as Paul puts it, not lifting up her hands to him on behalf of mankind, but holding out her life as an olive branch. So he says the virtue of a single soul was sufficient to put a stop to all the evil committed by men from the beginning of time. So the interesting part here is he says, since from the very beginning she stood foremost in the choir of the friends of God, and he also says that that she alone had made peace with God, and she was never in any need of reconciliation. Um, is that? I mean, I've never seen anybody write like this to that extent on the Eastern side, at least. I mean,
was he wrong?
From my perspective, what he's saying sounds a lot like the Immaculate Conception, where she was saved before she fell into the pit. But that's why I want to know your opinion on that.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like even using the term Immaculate Conception based on this description is limiting. I mean, he's saying so much more.
Right, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, he's
but
further.
That doesn't make it. It doesn't make like. I know the concept. Yeah, I don't. You ever hear the phrase? You can't be more Catholic than the Pope.
Yeah.
Like we do this on the regular.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
So if you're gonna find loftier language in this, but this is a great sermon. Keep going.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, folks can read this. I mean, it's a long sermon, but folks can read. This is the
just put the link here
on the Annunciation. Yeah, let me do that. I don't know if you're familiar with that website or not. You got it. Okay, sweet.
Perfect. I'm not familiar with it,
okay.
But it looks like a very complete sermon. So yeah, it's looking good.
Yeah,
I would recommend it.
Sweet. All right. Well, I think it's the good time to put a period. Any plugs, Father? You wanna direct the?
As always, you can go to our website nftu.net. Our channel NFTU True Orthodox News and Apologetics is being streamed there now. You can go to my Gab. I'm questioning whether we're going to have a Twitter again soon. Maybe, haven't decided yet. But ultimately, yeah, that's the easiest way to reach me. I'm pretty accessible most of the time, and can always reach me by email.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being on, Father. This was a good conversation. It was pleasant, and it didn't get controversial, and we didn't fight and tear each other.
That's for the next stream.
That's for the next one. Yeah, we'll save that for the next one. So, and we'll talk off air, and then we can set up a time and date for that as well. So, anybody who's watching, thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, blah, blah, blah. But everyone have a good night and God bless.